My name is Ivy Sterling, and I'm 27 years old. Right now, I'm sitting in a ridiculously expensive leather chair that feels as cold and unyielding as the people staring at me from across the polished mahogany table. The air in the law office is thick with the scent of old paper, lemon polish, and an almost suffocating sense of entitlement. My father, Robert Sterling, is here, looking every bit the titan of industry he is, his jaw set like granite. Beside him, my mother, Eleanor, adjusts the pearls at her throat, her expression one of pained boredom. And then there's my older brother, Marcus, the golden child, the heir apparent, who can't quite manage to keep the smug smirk off his face. They are my family, or they were, before they cut me out of their lives as easily as trimming a loose thread from a bespoke suit. They disowned me 2 years ago for a decision they called a betrayal, a catastrophic failure. They thought I was a waste of potential, a colossal disappointment who had willfully thrown her entire life away. They had no idea that in a few short minutes I was about to own theirs. The silence in this room is a coiled snake, ready to strike. But before I tell you exactly what was written in the will that made my family finally see me, I'd love to know where all of you are watching from today. Let me know down in the comments. And if you've ever felt completely and totally underestimated by the people who were supposed to believe in you the most, go ahead and hit that like button for me, for all of us. And if you're new here, make sure you subscribe, because this channel is a place for stories just like this. Stories about finding your strength when the world tries to take it from you. To understand the profound, earth-shattering silence that was about to fill that lawyer's office, you first need to understand the years of dismissive noise that came before it. You have to understand the Sterling family. We weren't just a family, we were a brand. My father, Robert Sterling, was the CEO and founder of Sterling Innovations, a tech firm he'd built from the ground up. He was a man who worshipped at the altar of legacy, success, and public perception. He didn't just want successful children, he demanded them as proof of his own greatness. Our lives were assets to be managed on his personal balance sheet. My mother, Eleanor, was the perfect corporate wife. Her domain was social standing, charity galas, and maintaining the flawless facade of the Sterling dynasty. She was beautiful, elegant, and had a heart that had been chilled to the same temperature as the champagne she was so fond of serving. And then there was Marcus. My older brother was my father's reflection in a younger, more arrogant mirror. He was being groomed to take over the company, a vice president by 25, with a corner office and a belief that the world owed him everything. He was the golden child, the proof that the Sterling method worked. And me? I was Ivy, the other one. I was the investment piece, the one designated to bring a different kind of prestige to the family name. I was slated to become Dr. Ivy Sterling. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a foregone conclusion, a path paved for me before I could even walk on it. The expectation was as heavy and constant as the air in our climate-controlled home. I was intelligent, yes, but my intelligence was only valued insofar as it could be molded into a shape my father approved of. Any deviation was treated not as a personality trait, but as a defect. I remember one specific Saturday when I was 10. I had spent weeks building a miniature volcanic system for the school science fair, complete with baking soda magma and a little pump I'd salvaged from an old fish tank. I had meticulously researched plate tectonics and magma chambers. I won first place. I came home clutching a big blue ribbon, my heart pounding with a pride so pure it felt like it could light up the whole house. I found my father in his study, a glass of scotch in his hand. I held up the ribbon. "Dad, look, I won." He glanced at it, a flicker of something, annoyance, indifference, in his eyes before his face settled back into its usual mask of authority. "That's nice, Ivy," he said, his attention already returning to the stock market ticker on his screen. "Marcus took second place in the regional tennis tournament today. Second place in the whole region. He's showing real competitive spirit." He then called Marcus into the study and spent the next half hour dissecting his backhand, promising to hire a better coach. My blue ribbon lay forgotten on the edge of his massive desk, looking small and childish. It was a pattern that repeated itself in 1,000 different ways. When I was 14, I fell in love with painting. I spent hours in my room with cheap acrylics and canvases, losing myself in colors and shapes. It was the only place I felt like I could breathe. I made the mistake of showing one of my better pieces, a moody landscape of the woods behind our house, to my mother during one of our formal family dinners. She held it at arm's length, a slight wrinkle in her nose as if she were smelling something unpleasant. It's colorful, dear, she'd said, placing it face down on a nearby credenza. My father didn't even look up from his steak. Art is a lovely hobby for a child, Ivy. But it's not a career. It's what people do when they have nothing serious to contribute. Your contribution will be in medicine. The conversation was over. My passion was relegated to the status of a childish whim, something to be outgrown, like pigtails or a belief in Santa Claus. The disparity became even more glaring as we got older. For his 16th birthday, Marcus was given a brand new BMW, its silver paint gleaming in the driveway, a giant red bow on the hood. He'd gotten a B- average that semester. For my 16th birthday, 6 months later, I received a complete, leather-bound set of Grey's Anatomy and a new laptop preloaded with medical school application software. I had a perfect 4.0 GPA. The message was crystal clear. Marcus was to be rewarded for simply existing, for being the heir. I was to be equipped for my function. Love, in the Sterling household, wasn't a feeling. It was a transaction based on compliance. And for a long time, I complied. I buried my own desires so deep I almost forgot they existed. I got into one of the top medical schools in the country just as my father had planned. I told myself I could do it. I told myself that one day, the pride in his eyes would be worth the sacrifice. But medical school was a unique and specialized form of hell. It wasn't the work itself. I was good at the memorization, the long hours, the complex problem solving. It was the crushing emptiness of it all. Each day felt like I was methodically building a life for someone else, a person I didn't know and certainly didn't like. I was a ghost haunting the hallways of my own future. The pressure was immense, a physical weight on my chest that made it hard to breathe. My father would call weekly, not to ask how I was, but for a progress report. He wanted to know my grades, my class ranking, my professors' opinions of me. He was monitoring his investment. The anxiety began to manifest in ugly ways. I couldn't sleep. I lost weight. My hands would shake before exams. It all came to a head during my second year, in the middle of a pharmacology final. I was staring at a question about beta blockers, and the words on the page started to swim. The room tilted. My heart began to hammer against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin, and the air thickened, impossible to draw in. I was having a full-blown panic attack. I stumbled out of the lecture hall, gasping for air in the empty corridor, the half-finished exam left on the desk. And in that moment, as I leaned against the cold cinder block wall, a horrifying clarity washed over me. I couldn't do it. I couldn't go back in there. Not just into the exam, but into that life. Continuing on this path wasn't just going to make me miserable. It was going to destroy me. Something inside me had finally snapped. I spent the next few weeks in a daze, going through the motions but feeling profoundly disconnected. I started skipping classes and spending time at the university hospital, not in the surgical theaters or lecture halls, but in the places no one else seemed to want to be. I volunteered on the palliative care ward. There, among patients facing the end of their lives, I found a sense of purpose that had been completely absent from my studies. I wasn't just treating a disease. I was caring for a person. I was holding hands, listening to stories, offering a quiet presence in their most vulnerable moments. It was about comfort, not cures. It was about dignity. It felt real. It felt meaningful. It was during one of these volunteer shifts that I saw a small, unassuming notice on a community bulletin board. It was printed on simple, cream-colored paper, a stark contrast to the glossy recruitment posters for pharmaceutical companies surrounding it. Live-in caregiver and companion sought for elderly gentlemen, it read. Artist, must have a patient heart and a good sense of humor. Light medical knowledge a plus, but a passion for life is essential. It felt less like a job posting and more like a message in a bottle. On a pure, unthinking impulse, I tore off the little tab with the phone number. A few days later, I found myself standing on the porch of a rambling, ivy-covered house in a quieter, older part of the city. The door was opened by the man himself, Arthur Paris. He was in his late 80s, his body contorted by the cruel sculptor of severe arthritis. but his eyes were as bright and sharp as chips of blue glass. He leaned heavily on a cane carved to look like a twisting serpent. The house behind him was a glorious, breathtaking mess. Canvases of all sizes were stacked against every wall, some vibrant with color, others stark and challenging. Half-finished clay sculptures sat on pedestals draped in damp cloths. Books were piled on every available surface. The air smelled of turpentine, old wood, and brewing tea. It was the complete antithesis of the sterile, minimalist mausoleum I grew up in. It was a house that was truly lived in. He led me into his studio, the heart of the chaos, and gestured for me to sit on a paint-splattered stool. He didn't ask about my medical school experience or my GPA. He asked me what I thought of the half-finished painting on his easel, a swirling vortex of dark blues and a single defiant slash of yellow. He asked me what book I'd last read that made me cry. He asked me what I was running from. The question was so direct, so perceptive. It stole the air from my lungs. I found myself telling him everything: the pressure, the panic attacks, the suffocating emptiness of the life my father had designed for me. I spoke for nearly an hour, and he just listened, his bright blue eyes never leaving my face. When I finally ran out of words, my voice hoarse with unshed tears, he simply nodded. "The girl I see before me is not a doctor," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "She is a prisoner, and your father, he's not a parent, he's a warden." He then offered me the job, but with a surprising condition. "I need a custodian for my failing body, that is true," he explained, gesturing to his gnarled hands. "But more importantly, I need an archivist for my work, for my legacy, someone with a good heart and a clear eye. The job is yours, Ivy, if you want it, but it requires you to be free." I knew what he meant. I had to make a choice. I could have the cage, or I could have the key. For the first time in my life, I chose the key. Telling my family was the hardest thing I had ever done. I drove home that weekend and gathered them in the formal living room, the one reserved for important guests and bad news. I stood before them, my hands trembling, and I told them I was dropping out of medical school. I told them I was going to be a caregiver for an artist. The silence that followed was heavy and dangerous. My father was the first to break it. His face, which had been a mask of disbelief, slowly hardened into a terrifying, cold fury. "Let me see if I understand this," he said, his voice dangerously low. "You are throwing away $250,000 education, a future of prestige and respect, to go and, what, change bedpans for some old crackpot?" The word crackpot hung in the air, dripping with contempt. "Robert, please," my mother started, but he cut her off with a sharp wave of his hand. "No, Eleanor, I want to hear this. I want to hear the logic." He turned his full wrathful attention back to me. "Is this what you think your life is worth? Being a servant?" "It's more than that," I tried to explain, my voice barely a whisper. "He's an amazing person. I'll be helping him organize his life's work. I feel happy for the first time in years." "Happy?" My brother Marcus scoffed from his armchair, where he'd been observing the scene with a kind of detached amusement. "Seriously, Ivy? Are you having some kind of breakdown? Just finish the degree. It's not that hard. Get the diploma, hang it on your wall, and then you can go play with your finger paints. This is just embarrassing." "Think of the embarrassment, Ivy," my mother chimed in, her voice rising with panic. "What will I tell the Montgomerys? What will I tell anyone? That my daughter, the future doctor, is now a nursemaid." The final blow came from my father. He stood up, his towering frame casting a long shadow over me. His face was pale with a rage so profound it seemed to vibrate. "I have spent my entire life building the sterling name. It is synonymous with success, with ambition, with excellence. It is not and never will be associated with charity cases or failures of nerve." He pointed a trembling finger toward the door. "If you walk out that door to go to that man, do not come back. You will be cut off. No money, no support, nothing. From this moment on, you are no daughter of mine." Tears were streaming down my face, but a strange calm settled over me. It was the calm of the condemned, of someone with nothing left to lose. I looked at their three faces, my father's fury, my mother's horror, my brother's contempt, and I saw strangers. I saw people who didn't know me and who had never cared to. I turned without another word, went upstairs, packed a single suitcase with my clothes and my few personal belongings, and I walked out of that house. The heavy front door clicked shut behind me, the sound of a lock turning, a final definitive severing. I was 25 years old, and I was utterly, terrifyingly alone. And for the first time in my life, I was free. The contrast between my old life and my new one was immediate and stark. The Sterling mansion was a place of oppressive silence and cold, minimalist surfaces. Arthur's house was a symphony of creative chaos and warmth. It smelled of life. The first few weeks were a period of intense adjustment. I was learning the intricate dance of being a caregiver, a rhythm of medications, specific dietary needs, and physical assistance. Arthur's hands were so gnarled with arthritis that he could no longer hold a fork properly on bad days, let alone a paintbrush. Helping him with these simple, intimate tasks, buttoning his shirt, cutting his food, was a lesson in humility and trust. But my role quickly expanded beyond the physical. Arthur's mind was a brilliant, sprawling library, and he appointed me his head librarian. He had stories that unspooled like epic poems, of backpacking through post-war Paris on a shoestring budget, of passionate arguments with other artists in smoke-filled Greenwich Village cafes, of a love affair with a fiery Spanish sculptor that burned bright and fast. He would talk for hours while I sat with him in the garden, and I would listen, completely captivated. He was the first adult in my life who spoke to me as an equal, who seemed genuinely interested in my thoughts, my feelings, my buried dreams. One afternoon, he found me sketching in an old notebook, something I hadn't done in years. I tried to hide it, the old shame drilled into me by my family flaring up. He gently took the notebook from my hands and studied the drawing, a simple charcoal sketch of his gnarled, paint-stained hands. He was quiet for a long moment. "You have an eye, Ivy," he said finally, his voice soft. "A real eye. You see the story in things. Your father was a fool to try and blind it." He then cleared out a small corner of his massive studio, set up a proper easel, and bought me a new set of professional-grade paints and charcoals. "The world has enough doctors," he declared. "It never has enough people who can teach us how to see." Under his gentle, expert guidance, I started to paint again, not as a hobby, but as a way of rediscovering the parts of myself I had been forced to lock away. While I was helping him organize his studio, cataloging decades of his work for his legacy project, I began to understand that Arthur Paris was far more than just a bohemian artist. Tucked away in old filing cabinets amidst sketches and letters were business ledgers and investment statements. I discovered that he had been an incredibly shrewd and successful early investor in a handful of tech startups in the 80s and 90s. He'd had an uncanny ability to see potential where others saw only risk. "Art doesn't pay the bills until it does," he told me with a wry grin one day when I asked him about it. "An artist must always have a side hustle. Mine was spotting the fire in people that everyone else was trying to extinguish." The words sent a shiver down my spine. It felt like he was talking about me. It was about a year into my time with him that he finally revealed the full extent of his connection to my family. We were sitting in his study, a fire crackling in the hearth, when he slid a thick, leather-bound folder across the table toward me. "I think it's time you understood the foundation of your father's house," he said. Inside were documents detailing his initial seed investment in Sterling Innovations, made almost 30 years ago. He had provided a significant portion of the capital Robert needed to get the company off the ground. "Your father was a brilliant engineer," Arthur explained, his eyes distant with memory. "But he was arrogant, even then. The banks thought he was too much of a risk. I didn't. I saw his fire." He had held his substantial block of shares quietly through a privately owned holding company he'd created called Paris Holdings. He wanted the investment, not the corporate drama that came with being on a board run by Robert Sterling. He knew my father would eventually resent him for it. Then he revealed the second, more shocking piece of the puzzle. "About 5 years ago," he continued, his voice dropping, "Sterling Innovations almost went under. Your father overextended on a new project, and the market turned. He was facing catastrophic failure. But Robert's pride is a fortress. He would rather die than admit to his board or to the public that he needed help. So, my father had sought a massive private bridge loan to stay afloat. He secured it from what he was told was a blind trust, a discreet financial entity that asked no questions as long as the collateral was sufficient. The collateral my father put up, in his desperation, was a huge portion of his own personal shares, the very shares that gave him a controlling interest in the company he had built. Arthur let out a long, slow breath. He never knew who was behind that trust. He never imagined that the old crackpot artist he so easily dismissed was the one holding his safety net. Arthur had orchestrated the entire thing through Paris Holdings. He was so quick to discard people he deemed beneath him, Arthur said, a deep sadness in his eyes. He never once considered that the hand he was biting might one day be the one holding his leash. The revelation left me breathless. It wasn't an act of malice on Arthur's part, I realized. It was an act of profound, hidden protection, and a deep, abiding disappointment in the man my father had become. During my 2 years with Arthur, contact with my family was almost non-existent. It was a silence that was both painful and liberating. About 6 months after I'd left, my mother called. Her voice was brittle, stripped of its usual social grace. "Ivy? I'm just calling to see if you've come to your senses yet." There was no warmth, no "how are you?" It was an interrogation. "I'm very happy, Mother," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. The line was quiet for a moment, and then she hung up without another word. A few weeks after that, I got a single venomous text from Marcus. It read, "Dad's still furious. You're completely cut out of the family trust, you know. Hope being a glorified servant is worth it." It was so cruel, so needlessly vicious, that I simply blocked his number. The last thread was cut. The second year was harder. Arthur's vibrant energy began to fade as his body betrayed him more and more. His heart was weakening, and the pain from his arthritis was becoming constant. There were more doctor's appointments, a few frightening trips to the hospital. The work became less about companionship and more about genuine medical care. I monitored his blood pressure, managed a complex regimen of medications, and helped him through long nights when the pain kept him awake. But it was no longer a job, and it certainly wasn't the servitude my family had accused me of. It was an act of love. It was an honor to care for the man who had, in every way that mattered, saved my life. He was my family. During these final months, his lawyer, a kind, silver-haired man named Mr. Henderson, became a frequent visitor. They would have long meetings in the study, the door usually closed. But sometimes Arthur would insist I join them. He wanted me to understand the structure of his estate, of his trust. He was clear, sharp, and resolute, even as his body grew frail. During one of those meetings, he looked directly at me, his blue eyes still piercingly bright. "They chose legacy over love, Ivy," he said, his voice weak but firm. "So I am leaving you a legacy they will be forced to love, or at least to respect." He informed me then that he had amended his will and his trust. I was to be his sole executor. "I trust your heart, my dear," he whispered, placing his trembling, papery hand over mine. "And I trust your judgment. Protect my legacy. All of it." Arthur passed away 2 weeks later, peacefully, in his sleep. I was the one who found him. The grief was a physical blow, a hollow ache in my chest so vast it felt like it might swallow me whole. The vibrant, chaotic, wonderful house suddenly felt silent and empty. With Mr. Henderson's help, I was the one who made the necessary calls, who handled the arrangements. My last, most difficult call was to my father's office. His assistant put me on hold for 5 minutes before he came on the line. I told him that Arthur Paris had passed away. There was a long pause. Then his voice, cold and clinical, came through the receiver. "I see. Well, these things happen. Let us know when the will is read. There may be some outstanding assets to discuss regarding his old investment." He didn't offer a single word of condolence. He didn't ask how I was. He didn't acknowledge my grief or the fact that I had just lost the most important person in my life. He just wanted to know about the money. He hung up, and I stood there in the quiet of Arthur's studio, the dial tone buzzing in my ear, and I finally understood. The man on the other end of that line was not my father. He was just Robert Sterling, a businessman looking to settle an account. And that brings me back to this room, the lawyer's office, a week after Arthur's funeral. I sat there, dressed in a simple black dress, feeling strangely calm. The storm of my initial grief had passed, leaving behind a quiet, steely resolve. I was here to honor Arthur's final wishes. My family, Robert, Eleanor, and Marcus, arrived together, a united front of wealth and arrogance. They strode in as if they owned the place, nodding curtly to the receptionist and taking their seats opposite me. They didn't look at me, didn't acknowledge my presence in any way, except for a contemptuous sneer from Marcus. "Hope you got a decent severance package, Ivy," he whispered across the table, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You're going to need it." I didn't respond. I just looked at him, my expression unreadable, and held his gaze until he uncomfortably looked away. Mr. Henderson entered then, carrying a thick leather-bound portfolio. He was a man who radiated a quiet authority, his posture impeccable, his suit understated and perfectly tailored. He had been Arthur's friend for over 40 years. He greeted me with a warm, sad smile, placing a reassuring hand on my shoulder for a brief moment. "Ivy," he said softly. Then he turned to my family, his expression shifting to one of cool, detached professionalism. "Mr. Sterling, Mrs. Sterling." He sat at the head of the table, opened the portfolio, and put on a pair of reading glasses. "We are here today to execute the last will and testament of Arthur Paris. I will now proceed." He began by reading a series of minor bequests. Arthur had left a generous donation to his alma mater, the Rhode Island School of Design, to fund a scholarship for promising young painters. He bequeathed a small but significant early painting to the local art museum. My family listened with growing impatience. Robert tapped his fingers on the polished table, an agitated rhythm that betrayed his polished exterior. He finally cleared his throat, interrupting the proceedings. "Mr. Henderson," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "While this is all very touching, my family had a long, if somewhat complicated history with Mr. Paris. We are primarily concerned with the disposition of his early investment assets in my company, Sterling Innovations." He leaned back in his chair, the picture of a man expecting to negotiate a favorable deal. He assumed the shares would be sold back to the company, or perhaps even gifted back, a final eccentric act from an old man. Mr. Henderson looked at my father over the rim of his glasses, his expression unreadable. "Of course, Mr. Sterling. We are getting to that." He then turned to a new page, his voice becoming clearer, more deliberate. "The next article concerns Mr. Paris's primary personal assets." He paused, and a hush fell over the room. It reads, "To my dear friend, my chosen family, and my devoted caregiver, Ivy Sterling, who showed me more kindness, loyalty, and love in 2 years than many have shown me in a lifetime, I leave my entire estate. This includes my home and the property upon which it sits, all of its contents, and my complete curated portfolio of personal artwork, with a recent appraisal value of approximately $8 million. The reaction was instantaneous. Eleanor gasped, her perfectly manicured hand flying to her pearl necklace. Marcus's jaw literally dropped, his smug expression melting into one of slack-jawed disbelief. My father's face went from confident to stunned and then darkened into a mask of pure fury. "That is absurd," he barked, slamming his hand down on the table. "It's preposterous. The man was clearly not of sound mind. She must have manipulated him, coerced him. She was his nurse." Mr. Henderson didn't even flinch. He held up a hand to silence the outburst, his calm authority cutting through my father's rage. "I can assure you, Mr. Sterling, that Arthur was perfectly lucid until the very end. Multiple physicians and psychiatrists can attest to his soundness of mind. He was very, very clear about his intentions." He then turned the page again, his voice dropping slightly, commanding the room. "And there is the matter of the trust." He looked at me, then back at my family. "The will continues. Furthermore, I name Ivy Sterling as the sole beneficiary and successor executor of the Arthur Paris Revocable Trust." He let the words hang in the air for a moment. This trust's most significant asset, he continued, is a holding company. My father and brother exchanged a confused look. The rage on my father's face was momentarily replaced by bewilderment. A holding company? Marcus asked, his tone dismissive. What is it called? I've never heard of him being involved in any other businesses. It is called Paris Holdings, Mr. Henderson stated calmly. The name meant nothing to them. I could see the wheels turning in my father's head, trying to place it, to assess its value, to see if it was something he could acquire. Mr. Henderson let them struggle for a moment before delivering the final, devastating blow. Paris Holdings is a private entity that holds two key assets of interest to you, he explained, his gaze fixed on my father. First, it holds the original 25% seed capital stake in Sterling Innovations, which Arthur acquired at the company's inception. My father paled slightly. That was a larger percentage than he had remembered or cared to admit. And second, Mr. Henderson continued, his voice as precise as a surgeon's scalpel, Paris Holdings is the entity that holds the debt and all associated collateral from a substantial private bridge loan made to Sterling Innovations approximately 5 years ago. As I'm sure you recall, Mr. Sterling, the collateral for that loan was an additional 26% of the company's voting shares, put up from your own personal controlling block. Absolute, profound, soul-crushing silence. You could have heard a pin drop on the thick carpet. I watched as the color drained completely from my father's face. He looked like he had been turned to stone. 25 plus 26. The simple, brutal arithmetic hung in the air between us. 51%. A controlling interest. That's not possible, my father whispered, his voice a hoarse, strangled sound. That was a blind trust, an anonymous lender. Arthur valued his privacy, Mr. Henderson replied, his tone devoid of any sympathy. As of the moment of his death, the Arthur Paris Revocable Trust, which is now fully and solely controlled by Miss Ivy Sterling, holds a 51% controlling interest in Sterling Innovations. The room was so quiet I could hear the frantic pounding of my own heart. I slowly turned my head and looked directly at the man who had disowned me. I saw the collapse of his entire world in his eyes. The shock, the denial, the horrifying, dawning comprehension. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't looking at a giant. I was looking at a small, broken man. I let the silence stretch, letting him drown in it. Then I spoke, my voice calm, steady, and completely empty of the pleading, desperate tone he was used to hearing from me. "Hello, Father." It was as if my voice had broken a spell. He surged to his feet, his face a mottled canvas of red and white. "This is a farce! A travesty!" he roared, his voice cracking. "She's a dropout, a caregiver. She knows nothing about business. She cannot run a trust, let alone a multi-million-dollar corporation. We will contest this. I will spend every last penny I have to see this mockery thrown out of court. You will not get away with this." I stood up as well, slowly, deliberately. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. All the power in the room had shifted, flowing from his side of the table to mine. "You're right," I said, my voice cutting cleanly through his tirade. "I am not a doctor. I'm a caregiver. I took care of Arthur until the very end. I gave him my word that I would protect his legacy." I held his gaze, unflinching. And as the executor of his trust and the new majority shareholder of this company, I intend to take care of his legacy. All of it. I then turned away from my sputtering father and looked at the lawyer, who was watching me with a small, proud smile. "Mr. Henderson," I said, my voice crisp and clear, "when can we schedule the first emergency board meeting? I believe I have some new business I'd like to discuss." The aftermath of the will reading was as explosive as I had anticipated. My family stormed out of the law office, a whirlwind of threats and furious, incoherent shouting. My mother was weeping, not from sadness, but from pure, unadulterated rage and humiliation. Marcus looked like he was going to be physically ill. My father just kept repeating the words contest and fraud like a broken mantra. I stayed behind with Mr. Henderson, the adrenaline slowly draining from my system, leaving me feeling hollow but resolute. He slid a simple, sealed envelope across the table. It just had my name on it, written in Arthur's familiar, spidery script. I opened it. It was a short letter. "My dearest Ivy," it began. "If you are reading this, then it means I have finally cashed in my chips. Do not mourn me for too long. I have lived 100 lives in my one. I leave you this burden, this power, not as an act of revenge, but as an act of faith. I have faith in your heart and in your strength. They built their kingdom on a foundation of pride and fear. I am giving you the tools to build something better. Just promise me one thing. Don't become them. Be better. With all my love. Arthur." The tears I had been holding back finally came, hot and silent. They weren't tears of sadness or anger, but of overwhelming gratitude. A week later, I made my first move. My father was expecting a lawsuit. He was expecting me to try and fire him, to start a messy public war. That's what he would have done. But Arthur's letter echoed in my mind. Be better. So, with Mr. Henderson's guidance, I did something else. I used my 51% authority to call an emergency meeting of the board of directors of Sterling Innovations. The other board members, a collection of men and women whose loyalty had always been tied to my father's power, were suddenly tripping over themselves to be accommodating. Their tone was one of deep respect and curiosity. The balance of power had shifted, and they were all excellent at political math. I walked into the boardroom at Sterling Innovations headquarters, a place I hadn't set foot in since I was a teenager. The long, imposing table was the same. My father, mother, who held a token, non-voting seat on the board for social purposes, and Marcus were already there. They looked like a trio of thunderclouds, their faces dark and stormy. I was dressed in a simple, well-tailored gray dress, my hair pulled back neatly. I didn't look like a vengeful heiress. I looked like a professional. I took the empty seat at the head of the table, the one that had always been my father's. I didn't gloat. I simply called the meeting to order. My first and only agenda item was a motion. I am calling for an immediate, full-scale, independent audit of the company's finances, operations, and all executive compensation packages for the last 5 years, I announced to the room. I want complete transparency. I believe it's time we understood the true health of this company. The motion was seconded immediately. My father sat there, speechless, his face a terrifying shade of purple. He couldn't stop it. I didn't have to fire him. I was simply shining a very bright light into all the dark corners he had worked so hard to keep hidden. A few days later, my mother showed up at Arthur's house. I was in the studio, trying to decide how best to preserve his unfinished work. It was the first time she had ever set foot on the property. She looked out of place, her expensive silk blouse and tailored trousers a stark contrast to the beautiful, paint-splattered chaos of the room. "Ivy, this has gone far enough," she began, her voice strained. "You've made your point. You've humiliated your father. He's a broken man. You have to stop this audit." I turned to face her, a paintbrush in my hand. "Stop what, Mother?" "Stop ensuring that the company Arthur invested in, the company that is now my responsibility, is fiscally sound. I am protecting his investment. It's the exact same thing I was doing for him when he was alive." Her face crumpled, a practiced expression of maternal distress. "We can be a family again," she pleaded, taking a step closer. "Just give it back, Ivy. Sign the shares over to your father. We'll give you whatever you want. A house, a trust fund of your own, anything." I looked at her, at this woman who was offering me trinkets in exchange for my soul, and I felt a profound sense of pity for her. "I already have a house," I said softly, gesturing around the studio. "I already have money. What I never had was a family, and you can't buy that." I walked to the front door and held it open for her. "Please leave, Mother." She stared at me, her mouth opening and closing, but no words came out. For the first time, she had no leverage, no power over me. She walked out, and I closed the door, the click echoing the sound of the door closing on my old life. This time, I was the one in control. Marcus tried a different tactic a few days after that. He called me, his voice oozing a false, brotherly camaraderie I hadn't heard since we were children. "Ivy, sis. Listen, Dad's losing it. He's old-fashioned, you know? But you and me, we could be a team. Think about it. We run the company together. We can take this thing to the next level. Get rid of the old guard. The desperation in his voice was pathetic. He saw his own position threatened and was trying to secure a new alliance. Thank you for the offer, Marcus, I said, my voice polite but firm. But I'll be making my own decisions based on the results of the audit, with the board's guidance. I hung up before he could respond. The Sterling family playbook, threats, bribery, and manipulation, no longer worked on me. I was writing a new book entirely. The audit took a month. When the results came in, they were even worse than I had imagined. It turned out Arthur's suspicions were spot on. My father and Marcus had been treating the company like their personal piggy bank. There were exorbitant, undocumented bonuses, personal vacations and vehicles disguised as company expenses, and a series of reckless, ego-driven investments that had cost the company millions and brought it to the brink of disaster 5 years earlier. They had been systematically draining it, all while maintaining a public facade of brilliant leadership. The audit report was my smoking gun. At the next board meeting, I presented the findings. The evidence was irrefutable. I didn't have to say a word against my father. The numbers spoke for themselves. I led the board in a unanimous vote of no confidence. Robert Sterling was removed as CEO of the company he had founded. In what the press release would call a gesture of respect for his legacy, I had the board approve a generous retirement package. It was a public grace I knew he didn't deserve, but it was a mercy Arthur would have wanted me to show. Marcus was stripped of his title and demoted to a minor role in the marketing department under the strict supervision of the new, highly respected professional CEO I had spent the last month headhunting. He was given a choice: accept the new role or resign. To my surprise, he accepted. His entitlement was second only to his fear of losing the Sterling money. I didn't take the CEO position myself. I knew my strengths, and more importantly, I knew my passions. My purpose wasn't to sit in a corner office. So I did something else. I created the Paris Foundation for the Arts and Palliative Care, a new philanthropic wing of Sterling Innovations, funded by a significant percentage of the company's revitalized profits. I became its director. I spent my days reviewing applications from young, struggling artists who just needed a chance and finding ways to fund hospice centers and palliative care training programs. I was using the power and the wealth not for revenge, but to build something beautiful, to create the kind of good in the world that Arthur had always believed in. It was his true legacy. A year passed. One evening, I was at a gallery opening in the city, the first exhibition for a brilliant young sculptor whose work the Paris Foundation had funded. The room was buzzing with energy and excitement. I felt a sense of peace and purpose I had never known possible. Across the crowded room, I saw them. My father and mother. They hadn't been invited, but they were here. They looked smaller, older. The arrogance had been replaced by a kind of weary caution. They approached me hesitantly. It was my father who spoke first. "Ivy," he said, his voice quiet, almost rough. He looked around the room, at the art, at the happy crowd. "The foundation, it's good work. Very impressive." It was the closest he would ever come to an apology. It was the closest he would ever come to admitting I had been right. It was the first compliment he had ever given me that felt real. I just looked at him, at the man who had caused me so much pain, and I felt nothing. No anger, no desire for more. Just a quiet, settled peace. "Thank you," I replied simply. "It's what Arthur would have wanted." The conversation was over. There was no tearful reunion, no grand scene of forgiveness. The chasm between us was too wide to ever be fully bridged, but the war was over. I had won, not by destroying him, but by building something better. I had moved on. I didn't need his approval anymore. I had finally, truly, found my own. In the end, my family's greatest insult became my greatest gift. They disowned me for choosing a path of compassion over one of prestige. And that very path led me to the one person who saw me for who I truly was. Arthur Paris taught me that family isn't about blood, it's about love, respect, and acceptance. He showed me that true wealth isn't measured by stock prices or the size of your house, but by the richness of your life and the positive impact you have on others. He taught me that your value is not determined by the family you are born into, but by the one you choose to build around you. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can possibly inherit isn't a fortune or a company, but the quiet, unshakable freedom to simply be yourself. So, I want to hear from you. Share your own story in the comments below. Have you ever had to choose between your family's expectations and your own happiness? What did you do, and what did you learn from it? Your stories give all of us strength. And if my story resonated with you, please don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more stories about finding your power. Share this video with anyone you think might need to hear it. Thank you so much for joining me today, for listening to my journey. I hope it inspires you to honor your own path, no matter how much noise the world makes telling you you're going the wrong way. Remember to be brave and be kind.